Welcome back. This time we are with Chad Cummings. He's an attorney on business law and a college professor at Florida Gulf Coast College. And I would like to address with him the last, what we should expect from the last episode of Trump's tariff soap opera. Because just today, just yesterday, has been the Yale lab came with a new report about the new episodes, and that it doesn't even include the 15% that Trump would have agreed with Japan for all the sports that have caused upheaval among automakers, right? So, if you would like to give us your take on this, considering two things: the uncertainty all this is causing, nothing seen since Smooth Holly, and Smooth Holly was just one installment. Not it didn't have this backs and forth that has created all this uncertainty, and what we could do to protect the economy from this uncertainty at the level of the Court of International Trade.
Okay, very good, Alfredo. You are right and let's zoom out for just a second. As you alluded, the primary problem or the primary issue that's here is one of uncertainty, right? We have an environment now where small businesses and multinational corporations alike are subjected to these throes, these ravages even of uncertainty on a daily, almost on an hourly basis. And thinking about that, putting myself in the position of the small business owner or the CEO of a multinational, your question is a valid one, which is how do these fiduciaries take appropriate actions to reduce, not eliminate, that's probably impossible, but to reduce the uncertainty and the effects, not just upon their financial performance and their bottom line, but on their livelihoods, right? Most businesses in the United States are small businesses, and they don't have a team of attorneys and financial advisors and economists there to help them. Thinking back to previous administrations, the biggest change that we are seeing now is the application of tariffs in the realm of foreign policy, and more concretely and specifically to serve foreign policy objectives, which is not completely unprecedented, but it is certainly unprecedented in modern times. And for that reason, and I'll come back to your question in just a moment, I'm just laying some of the context here, at least as I understand it. This is creating very interesting tensions between the three branches of government, right? We have the executive, we have the legislative, and we have the judicial. And going back to the system of federalism that was established way back in the late 18th century when the Constitution was adopted, at least in theory, academically, we're supposed to have these three branches of government that tend to themselves, that they're not supposed to interfere in another branch of government unless they have a legitimate and valid reason for doing so, and even then only under particular circumstances. Having said that, to your point, it has been a bit of a cat and mouse game, right? We have tariffs that are being enacted almost unilaterally. I would say beyond, well, it's not almost, it is unilaterally by the executive branch, being pressed into service in support of foreign policy objectives and to create leverage to extract those gains at the negotiating table, which are not just trade related. That's the biggest point, is that these tariffs, yes, they're called reciprocal, and in some cases they are, but they're not just about trade, right? That's the big message. That's the big change. It's not just about trade. Now it's about defense. It's about public health initiatives. It's about myriad other things that are way, way, way beyond what we would traditionally consider to be the ambit of trade negotiations. The big case earlier this year was the VOS selections back in May, the end of May of this year. And in that case, we found out, or rather, it was the holding of the court, that those new tariffs exceeded the president's statutory authority, what us attorneys call ultra vires, which is a Latin phrase simply meaning beyond one's power. And that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, does not promote or allow the president unlimited authority to impose these tariffs, because at a certain point, it becomes an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power, keeping in mind, and this is a little bit of a civics lesson and maybe more detailed than you want, but I think it's really critical to lay the groundwork, that our Constitution, Article 1, only allows Congress to impose taxes and levies, right? And there are certain very narrow exceptions to that, and we have constitutional amendments, but that core concept still stands. And the Supreme Court has said repeatedly over the centuries that it is not permissible to allow Congress to delegate all of their powers. They can't simply shift their core responsibilities, and the taxation authority, of course, being one of those core responsibilities, to another branch of government, in this case, the executive. And then, of course, on top of that, we have the judicial branch chiming in, acting as the check and balance, as it's supposed to, Alfredo. So to come back to your core question, what can business owners do, whether they're a small business owner or they're on the board of directors of a Fortune 100 enterprise? The very regrettable answer is not much, but let me be a little bit more precise. I think the first topic, or the first point, and this is something you and I discussed before, is to understand that these are not set in stone, that they're continuing to change on an hourly basis. And so we can't panic and lose our minds every time we see a new headline. We have to adopt temperate language. We have to adopt a measured approach, understanding that just because a trial balloon, and that's what these tariffs are to a certain extent, trial balloons, to the extent that they are being used as trial balloons, we don't allow that to impact our day-to-day decision making until there is a final answer. But of course, that's easier said than done. So from a more pragmatic perspective, what do I do if I'm a small business owner? I probably pull up my profit and loss statement from the end of last year. I probably add 30 to 40% for all of my imports. I probably add 15 to 20% for all of my other expense line items, be they salary, be they fuel, marketing, administrative expense, and so forth, to account for the second and third level consequences caused by inflation. Inflation, of course, the elephant in the room with tariffs. We were already in an inflationary environment. Until the tariff matter is resolved, I think that's just going to continue and amplify. And so from a practical standpoint, how do we account for that? We have to make some projections to account for that. It's of course easier said than done, because when you have a board of directors, you are accountable to the shareholders. And then of course, when you increase those expenses, what happens? Your projected or forecasted earnings per share go down. The shareholders are unhappy. Maybe there's a shakeup in the board. So Alfredo, I could talk about this all day. I probably am a little off track at this point, but does that answer your question?
I would like to focus a bit more on the Court of International Trade, because it's true the law allows the executive power to temporarily use tariffs under certain conditions, like national security, disruption of an industry, etc. But this is not the kind of tariff stuff that Trump launched on the so-called Liberation Day, April 2. And yet the number one is the the Court of International Trade found that it had competency to address this issue and rule against the number two. The problem is that I believe that ruling has been suspended until by an appeal court until this until the Supreme Court has a final say on this decision, right?
That's correct. And that just goes to the fact that this is more uncertainty. How long is it going to take to work its way to the Supreme Court?
Mm-hmm.
I can't give you that answer. I don't think any attorney can. We can guess, we can always speculate, but that doesn't do a whole lot of good for the small business owner. As to your question as to the authority of the court to rule in this matter, I don't think that that's seriously in question. The only question, though, is will those same arguments that are being made by the administration withstand scrutiny on appeal? Thinking about the purpose of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, it's right there in the name, right? Typically, this is something that we're using in wartime, or I should say that should be used in wartime, or when there is a concrete, specific, highly defined emergency.
But let me interrupt you. I believe this decision by the Court of International Trade has to be suspended until the Supreme Court has the final say, right?
Correct. But once it goes up to the Supreme Court, what is the first thing the Supreme Court's going to do? They're going to look at the record of fact that was built in lower courts, right? And oftentimes they're going to either adopt that same reasoning or similar reasoning, or they're going to refute it.
Yeah, and my question is, are there more cases before the Court of International Trade? Because April 2 was not the end of the story. There have been, after April 2, were there more threats and actually tariffs that has been imposed, right? So are there more cases before this special court?
Dozens, as far as I know, there are dozens of cases pending, but at the end of the day, they're all going to be resolved on a single issue, really actually two issues. One, does the judiciary have the authority, going back to the separation of powers issue that I was talking about a few minutes ago, does the judiciary have that authority under the Constitution to act as the check and balance? I believe that they do, but we pit that against the very broad power afforded to the executive branch. Here's where it starts to cross the line. And as I understand it, if I were to approach this and argue against the tariffs, if that was my job, I was hired as an attorney to go into court, I would attack them on two grounds. First, whenever you have a constitutional issue, that's what you go for. At least one of the issues, if you can make it and if it's really there. And in this case, I think it is. You have the separation of powers. Let's call it a question, right? Because you can nip it in the bud. The other side of that coin, though, talking about the authority of the executive branch, is the judiciary branch. Article 3 of the US Constitution, do they have the right to enjoin the executive branch? The answer is they do in certain cases. So to answer your question, are there other cases? Of course, absolutely. But getting down into the substance and the minutia of each of the cases is largely irrelevant because they're political issues at the end of the day, right? Courts, especially the Supreme Court, are reluctant to address political issues. It's one of their long-standing rules, which is not to say that they never do, right? It's unavoidable in any case to some extent. But until, as you say, it works its way up to SCOTUS, there's ambiguity. There's that uncertainty that we keep coming back to.
Now, just for everybody to have this clear, is we have tariffs that are in effect. We have tariffs that have been threatened but suspended. And we have tariffs like, for instance, pharmaceuticals, lumber, that have been threatened but not just never put in effect. Are all these three categories, is it possible to bring to this court with the limitations, the protection this court can bring, but is it possible to bring all these cases to before this court, even for instance pharmaceuticals and lumber, or only those tariffs that are in effect?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I have to answer it in two parts. The first point is that from a practical perspective, the Supreme Court, they're not stupid. Whether you agree or you disagree with their reasonings, they don't live in a bubble, they don't live in a vacuum. So they understand that there is an urgent need for finality. And so, from that perspective, and this is not unique to tariffs, look at criminal procedure, look at any of the other areas of law that the Supreme Court addresses, environmentalism. They being the justices on the Supreme Court, first off, from a procedural perspective, a lot of these cases can and will likely be consolidated, right? It's not going to be one case goes up to the Supreme Court. And then
but it's not necessary that the tariff is in effect. For instance, a business association could bring a case against the tariff Trump has threatened on lumber or on pharmaceuticals.
That's my second point. So that's an excellent segue into my second point. The Supreme Court requires something called standing. And standing, of course, is a very politically sensitive topic within the last few years. But to your point, Alfredo, and I'm going to come back to my first point because the first point answers the second point, but let me address your point directly. The very short answer is no. There has to be what is known as an injury in fact, right? The Supreme Court can't take a case, or at least theoretically they could, but as long-standing practice, they will not take a case unless there's been what they call a concrete, particularized injury in fact. So all of that to say, if there's threat of a tariff or an embargo, that alone is not sufficient. There has to be something
even if that causes uncertainty and so affects supply chains and investment decisions. That's not taking as an injury.
It's probably not sufficient as an injury. Now, if I'm that attorney arguing that side of the case, I will make that argument. The uncertainty itself is an injury. But we have to remember, Alfredo, we have a Supreme Court that is largely conservative at this point. And unavoidably, there's that political aspect of greater deference to the executive branch. So there is an argument certainly to be made that there is an injury in fact, that there is standing. At the end of the day, the court is not going to focus on those because they already have other cases, other disputes that are what they call ripe, where there is a tariff that's not just threatened, but has already been put in place. But here, this goes back to my first point, and this is the important part. As I said, the Supreme Court doesn't rule in a vacuum. They're not stupid people. They're going to come up with a ruling or attempt to craft a ruling, I should say, that addresses at least what they perceive to be the major issue, which goes back to the two issues, separation of power and impermissible delegation of authority. If they do that, that will resolve a great deal of the uncertainty, even if a particular embargo or tariff on, as you say, lumber, even if that's not in the case, of course that will affect that and resolve it. Does that mean it's going to be resolved favorably? I don't know, but there will be an extinguishment of that ambiguity once SCOTUS has a chance to consider it.
And just to have it completely clear, those tariffs that have been imposed but then suspended would also fall into the same definition. They would not present an injury as the court understand them. Only tariffs that are in effect could be fought in court.
The short answer is yes, but to add a little bit more, and I'll keep it short because I want to be mindful of our time. The somewhat longer answer is it's actually at that point falls under a different Supreme Court doctrine called the doctrine of moot, M-O-O-T, mootness, in that it's no longer an issue. That's a very brief summation and probably an oversimplification of the concept. But you're right. The answer to your question is SCOTUS will not consider something if, in their view, it's already been resolved. Of course, you and I might argue about whether or not it's truly been resolved. But if a tariff has been suspended, it's not something that they're going to consider under most circumstances, which is not to say that they won't address the ambiguity. I believe that they will, and that will apply moving forward. That will address a lot of the cases that are not even in front of the court, just from a purely practical perspective. But yes, to answer your question.
Even though in business terms, the uncertainty is causing more harm than the tariffs themselves, even though the Supreme Court would see only real injury, present injury in those that are in effect.
Alfredo, I know it sounds crazy. This goes back to the founding fathers. One of the founding fathers, John Jay, had a serious issue with this, the same issue that you and I are talking about now. The Supreme Court does not like to issue advisory rulings. They don't like to consider issues unless there's an injury in fact. They don't want to, there has to be standing. And if something's moot, typically they won't consider it either, except in very rare circumstances. So as absurd as that might seem to some people, and I agree that if we follow that rule strictly every time, as you say, the uncertainty is a greater problem than having the final answer, right? What if it's 15%, it's 15%. We build that into our price. Yeah, there's some inflation, but we're done. But we don't know. We're left in the limbo. We're left in the no man's land. So you're absolutely right. The frustration is real.
Any law-related consideration you would like to bring to our attention?
Sorry, Alfredo, could you say that again?
Any other law-related consideration that you would like to bring to our attention?
It's a good question, because when we focus on separation of powers issue, when we focus on the delegation of powers issue, sometimes we lose sight of the human factor. But in terms of other specific concrete legal angles that you could approach this, there are many. At the end of the day, thinking if I was sitting on that bench up in Washington, which I'm not, it's probably a good thing that I'm not, I would always focus on those two core issues, right? These cases are complicated enough without bringing in additional detail that's not going to turn on or resolve the core issues, the separation of powers issue especially. So in terms of other legal angles, thinking about putting my professor cap on for a second, I come back to the Interstate Commerce Clause, which is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the US Constitution. And there is another concept there that is not in the text of the Constitution, but which has been created by what is known as common law, called the Dormant Commerce Clause, which, to summarize in a very small nutshell, essentially says two things. One, it's the exclusive purview of the federal government to manage affairs or to pass regulations or laws that impact or influence interstate commerce. Of course, tariffs and international trade are a little bit broader than that. That's still the exclusive purview of the federal government. But if I was really creative, and I mean really creative, I might start thinking about how, if I'm an attorney, I could somehow look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 and the Dormant Commerce Clause and turn that to my advantage. The problem with doing so here, and this is where we come to the dormant part of the Dormant Commerce Clause, is that yes, as an enumerated power, Congress has that authority to regulate interstate commerce, but the other side of that hill is that states do not. States have very limited ability to regulate or influence interstate commerce. So are there other angles? There are. Unfortunately, and the reason we make that side quest, if you will, into talking about the Dormant Commerce Clause is simply to highlight that we're all waiting. It's a waiting game. You're waiting, I'm waiting, State courts really can't do much with it, right? They don't have the jurisdiction. They don't have the subject matter jurisdiction. Federal courts do, right? Because they have that authority to address questions of federal law. To Alfredo, I wish I had another answer. I wish I had a silver bullet that I could point to, but I don't. We're all in the waiting room right now.
Now let me move to the more economic considerations. Um, we have mentioned uncertainty, and we see inconsistencies in this law in this wave of tariffs. For instance, the one I mentioned, 15% on Japan, while
Right.
we have 25% on aluminum and steel. We have arbitrariness, for instance, the 30% tariff on Brazil, just because they want to prosecute Bolsonaro after an attempt coup. We have unsustainable tariffs like the 20% imposed on Vietnam, considering that that may have been something Vietnam had caped to under duress, but it's not going to be last long because of the close integration between Vietnam and China.
Yes.
So we see lots of uncertainty created not just by this backs and forth by the so I am saying this because you said geopolitical considerations, but there doesn't seem to be an adult serious compass in these considerations. It seems to be they seem to depend more on the mood of the president, on his sympathy or antipathy towards some country or so. And none of these would wait even a bit before the courts.
Let me answer your first question about the political aspect, and then I'll answer the second question about the court.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very specific reason why we're not yet seeing the political shockwaves, right? We are 6 months in to a president's term. Midterms are still way off on the horizon. So I see one of two possibilities focusing on the political aspect. Option one, if through a, and this is an important point because there's no one big trade deal. There's no multilateralism. It's all bilateralism. That is the foreign policy of this administration for the most part, is bilateralism, not multilateralism. Through a series, and this is hypothetical option number one, right? Through a series of bilateral agreements, the tariff uncertainty is removed and negotiated away over a period of time. And then you have the structural cost increases that get built into the economy, cause inflation, and those are passed down to the consumer. That's a lot of work. That's a lot to happen before the midterm elections, but it's possible. And of course, it's not all or nothing. The other side of that is that if that outcome has not been realized, and of course, it's not the day of the midterm election, it's in the weeks and the months leading up to it. And you better believe this will be a major, major talking point for the Democrat Party. It's one of their strongest talking points, probably, at least.
Will be because by then the effects on prices are going to be felt.
Exactly. If this back and forth, well, let me focus on the uncertainty because I think that's the core of your question. But you're right. At that point, the effects will be felt, and then there will be a greater influence upon our elected representatives in Congress, more specifically the House of Representatives. If the Republicans lose control of the House of Representatives in the midterm, I'm not so much thinking about the Senate, I'm thinking about the House in this analysis. Yeah. That may be the reason right there, is the effects will have been felt. People don't like that. People, maybe they don't have time to pay attention to the news or read foreign policy white papers, right? But they know that they're paying more at Lowe's or Home Depot or Ace Hardware, right? The other side of that, though, is that if they're not resolved by then, and this goes back to the uncertainty aspect, people hate uncertainty. They would rather have a bad outcome that's known than the possibility of a good outcome that's nebulous and unrealized. So either way, you're going to have political pressure. But to your point, we're not feeling it yet. What's to be done? There's from a political standpoint, you can call your rep, but from we're smart people. We don't want to waste our time. We know that's probably not going to do anything. So we're probably not going to see any political effect on this until you have midterms, and it's going to be something of a hangover. Now, again, could all this be resolved by then? Maybe, but we live in the real world. We know it's not going to be that clean.
Now, I would like to address this from the point of view of other heads of states, of economic actors abroad. They see a country where there is a new tariff policy that has no compass. It depends on the whims of the president. On the disinformation of the president, you must remember those two moments where he threatened with tariffs Apple and Mattel, as if Apple and Mattel were countries. Uh, but on the other side, you see that complete silence from the Democratic Party. And if you that's why probably some of the moves from, for instance, from Canada, that is trying to divert the supply chains to other markets, maybe not reversible. Considering that, how do you plan for 2029 if the Democratic Party doesn't promise something different?
Sure.
And that it would have to be something different from Biden. Then you have to plan for to reroute your markets and supply chains to other markets for good, right?
The question of structural, you use the word, I don't, well, I'll use the word permanent, right? The question of permanent change. When we talk about this, Alfredo, I come back to the threats, and this is a little bit outside the scope, but it's a very close parallel. The threats by the Department of Treasury and other instrumentalities of the federal government to require international banks to use the FedWire system and to impose sanctions on Russia and other countries. When you don't play by our rules, you're not allowed to use our financial systems. What has that done? Because that is a preview of what can happen from a standpoint of trade. We have seen other countries like Russia, like multinationals like the EU, develop their own parallel financial systems like China. And when the threat is gone, which is a nice euphemism for saying when there's a different administration, are those countries going to drop everything and step away from the infrastructure, the financial and the technological infrastructure that they've built to come back to the United States? Probably not. Along the same lines, if your question is, are there going to be permanent changes in the global supply chain because of this? Absolutely. Why are you? I think you're also asking, why is the Democrat Party not beating the war drum on this, or at least not more strongly? That's a very nuanced question, and it's a double-edged sword, because historically, or what was one of the largest bases, largest constituencies of the Democrat Party? It was labor unions, right? You have this narrative. I'm not going to say whether it's true or false. That's for your viewers to decide. But you have a narrative that, at least in theory, tariffs are supposed to help local industry. Does that happen in the real world? I think we know the answer to that. But to your point, it's still about uncertainty. If I put myself in the shoes of somebody at the General Motors plant, General Motors has a massive plant in Arlington, Texas. So let's put myself there for just a moment. I would rather have comfort and certainty and have the tariffs resolved, or at least have a number that I can work with, because then I'm not worried. Am I going to have to retrain for a new job? So why are the Democrats not touching it? Two reasons. I think one, They're afraid of upsetting their base, although whether or not that's still one of the core bases of their party is something of a question after the most recent election. Certainly, if I was in the Democrat Party leadership, I would be looking at that very closely.
Yes, you were saying that definitely, if you were the CEO of General Motors, you would prefer a bad outcome on tariffs than this continuous uncertainty. So you have to plan for the worst case scenario. Otherwise, you may end up ending in red, right?
Yes, the only saving grace, if you will, if I'm that CEO, or I was actually putting myself in the shoes of an employee on the assembly line. But the interests, at least in this case, are there's a lot of overlap there. I think we have to ask, how long is this going to continue? It goes back to what we said. How soon is the Supreme Court going to take it up? Right. But the saving grace or the silver lining, such that it is that the other automotive manufacturers are also dealing with the same issue. So in a competitive economy, when one person's prices go up, normally what do? We change suppliers. Everybody's prices are going up. What do you do then? You sit and you wait and you ride it out, and you grit your teeth and you bear through that uncertainty, which nobody really wants to do. You don't, I don't. But what else can we do? As we say, midterms are a ways off. But once the current news cycle dies down, and there's no shortage, you know what I'm talking about over the last week, I would expect this, again, if I'm strategic, and that was my motivation, I would make this my central issue. I would start beating it into the heads of voters. Of course, whether or not that party's leadership chooses to do that, or if they choose to proceed with another angle of attack, who can say?
I completely agree, because it's much better that to sell the problem before the problem erupts, and then be proven right, than looking detached just because you are waiting for the problem to erupt.
Exactly. Proactive. Be proactive. Right. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party is not doing that at all. What leaves people having to decide for what to do in the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario implies either waiting for clarity and creating a war chest that is going to be unprofitable, or moving to another market, diversifying
Yes.
the risking from the United States.
Alfredo, let me make one more point, and it's again, it's a little bit off topic, but it informs the current question. Why is the Democrat Party not pushing this issue harder? Part of that is they have a leadership vacuum, right, after the most recent election. The sooner they can decide who the leader, the standard bearer of their party is going to be, whether it's Pritzker or Newsom or somebody else, that person will set the tone at the top. There's all this confusion right now because they're lacking leadership. That's not going to last forever. I think as soon as you see that issue resolved, this issue will fall in line almost immediately after that.
And I would say it's much worse, because they inherited the rules-based system from FDR, and they have not been brave enough to defend it, because they already have a rich legacy. No, it's not theory, it's history. So it's something that happened in the past.
Sure,
And they have not been able even to defend even that. They just keep playing that. But I wanted to give you the last word, because I know our time is short. And please, any other issue you believe it's important to bring to the spotlight?
No, Alfredo, I think through the course of our conversation, we covered a lot of the topics I wanted to address, particularly from a political angle. The only other thing I might add is, to your point, how it's easy enough to take the advice that I had at the beginning of the interview, which is look at your profit and loss statement or your financial statement from 2024 and add 25% to your expenses. But to your point, how do we begin forecasting for 2029 and beyond? You have to do some multivariate analysis, but a lot of those analyses are probably going to factor in an assumption, as you said just a few moments ago, that there will be structural, permanent changes to the supply chain, that you will continue to see BRICS growing in influence and authority, and the EU. Of course, could the gamble pay off and it goes the other direction? Sure, but we don't have the crystal ball. So, as you say, we have to plan for the worst case scenario and hope for the best.
Hmm. And that leaves us in a very difficult spot because the world is
Yes.
not waiting for us. They keep moving on.
Excellent.
So
Very well said.
thank you very much for your time, for all the information you have shared with us. I would like to convoke you for some time in August when we have more clarity about what is going to happen with Trump's tariffs, where they are postponed again, or what happens, or if he finally provides on his promise on pharmaceuticals, lumber, and whatever he crosses his mind during that time.
Excellent. Very good.
Okay, thank you again, and that will be all for now.
Thank you, Alfredo. Have a great day.